Every fighter pilot in the European theater knew the rule. Never attempt a full barrel roll during a turning engagement. The maneuver bled too much speed, left you vulnerable, made you a sitting target for any competent enemy pilot. Training manuals called it suicide. Commanders court-martialed pilots who tried it. The rule was absolute. But on the morning of November 14, 1944, over the forests of eastern France, Second Lieutenant Robert Johnson broke that rule at 8,000 feet altitude while a Focke-Wulf 190 was lining up to kill him. What happened in the next 12 seconds would rewrite American fighter tactics for the remainder of the war. 3 weeks later, Johnson's entire squadron, 23 P-47 Thunderbolts, would face more than 50 German fighters in the largest air battle over the Rhine Valley that month. Standard tactics said half the American pilots would die. The Germans had numerical superiority, veteran pilots, and aircraft specifically designed to outturn the heavy American fighters. But Johnson had taught every pilot in his squadron one illegal maneuver, one technique that doctrine declared impossible, one move that enemy pilots would never expect, because everyone knew it could not work. By sunset on December 7, 1944, 23 American fighters would return to base. Every single pilot would walk away alive. The Germans would lose 14 aircraft. And the maneuver that saved them would remain classified and unacknowledged in official records for 30 years. This is the story of how one pilot's desperation became an entire squadron's salvation. Second Lieutenant Robert Andrew Johnson was 22 years old and had been in combat for exactly 47 days when he discovered that everything he had been taught about air combat was wrong. Johnson was from Amarillo, Texas, where his father had run a crop dusting service before the Depression forced them to sell the planes. Robert had grown up around aircraft, had learned to fly in his uncle's Piper Cub when he was 15 years old, joined the Army Air Forces 2 weeks after Pearl Harbor, and spent 18 months in training before shipping overseas to join the 352nd Fighter Group in September 1944. He was assigned to the 487th Fighter Squadron, based at an airfield designated Y-29 near Asch, Belgium. The squadron flew Republic P-47 Thunderbolts, massive single-engine fighters that weighed 7 tons empty and could absorb punishment that would destroy lighter aircraft. Johnson had flown 23 combat missions by mid-November, all bomber escort. Long flights over Germany protecting B-17s and B-24s from Luftwaffe interceptors. Johnson was cautious, methodical, and observant. His flight instructors back in Arizona had noted that he studied enemy aircraft recognition cards obsessively and asked technical questions other cadets ignored. He wanted to understand not just how to fly his aircraft, but why it behaved the way it did, what its actual limitations were versus what the manual claimed. That curiosity would save his life. By November 1944, the Luftwaffe was desperate. German pilots were throwing everything they had at American bomber formations. The air battles over the Reich had become savage, close-range knife fights, where speed and altitude advantage meant nothing if you could not outturn your opponent in the critical 3 seconds when guns were in range. Johnson had watched 7 pilots from his squadron die in those 3 seconds. Good pilots, men who followed doctrine perfectly. Men who died because they did exactly what they had been trained to do. Their names were written in black marker on the wall of the operations tent. Lieutenant Thomas Brennan, First Lieutenant Michael Santos, Second Lieutenant James Kirkwood, Second Lieutenant Paul Henderson, Flight Officer Robert Chen, Second Lieutenant William Rodriguez, Captain David McKenna. Johnson had known McKenna the best. McKenna was the operations officer, 26 years old, had flown 58 combat missions, should have been rotated home but volunteered to stay. McKenna had talked Johnson through his first mission, had given him advice about managing fear, had told him that the trick to survival was staying calm and following the manual. McKenna died on November 9, 1944, when a Messerschmitt Bf-109 got on his tail during a turning engagement and he could not shake it. The German pilot simply outturned him, stayed behind him, and shot him down. The entire squadron monitored the radio channel. Everyone heard McKenna calling for help. Everyone heard the cannon fire. Everyone heard the silence afterward. Johnson requested a copy of the combat film from McKenna's gun camera, watched it 17 times, studied every second. McKenna had done everything right according to doctrine, had used throttle discipline, had attempted to dive away, had tried to use his aircraft's superior roll rate to escape. Nothing worked. The Germans stayed with him. The film ended with cannon strikes walking up the fuselage toward the cockpit. Johnson could not stop thinking about it. The problem was fundamental, and everyone knew it, but nobody talked about it openly. The P-47 Thunderbolt could not outturn German fighters in horizontal engagements. The Thunderbolt was a 7-ton monster built around a 2,000 horsepower radial engine. It was fast in a dive, could absorb incredible damage, had 8 50 caliber machine guns, and could carry bombs and rockets. But in a turning fight at low to medium altitude, a Focke-Wulf 190 or Messerschmitt Bf 109 could turn inside it every single time. American doctrine compensated for this with altitude tactics. Thunderbolt formations stayed above German fighters, used speed and diving attacks, hit and run, never got into sustained turning engagements. The manual was explicit. If a German fighter got on your tail in a turn, you dove away, used your superior speed, and separated. You did not try to outturn them. But by late 1944, German pilots had figured out the American tactics. They baited American pilots into turning fights. They engaged at lower altitudes where Thunderbolts could not dive away. They forced close-range engagements where American pilots had two choices: turn with them and die, or try to dive away and get shot while accelerating. The 352nd Fighter Group had lost 19 pilots in October alone, 14 more in the first 2 weeks of November, almost all in turning engagements they could not escape. The numbers were unsustainable. Johnson had known most of them at least casually. Some he had known well. Lieutenant Thomas Brennan died on October 23rd. Brennan was from Philadelphia, 24 years old, had a pregnant wife back home. He had shown Johnson photographs of her every chance he got. Brennan got into a turning engagement with 2 FW-190s over Cologne, followed doctrine, tried to dive away. One of the German pilots anticipated the move and shot him during the dive. Brennan's Thunderbolt went straight into the ground from 4,000 feet. No parachute, no survival possibility. First Lieutenant Michael Santos died on October 27th. Santos was from Los Angeles, had been a Golden Gloves boxer before the war, was supposed to rotate home in 2 weeks, got bounced by 4 Bf-109s while protecting a crippled bomber. Santos turned hard to defend the bomber. Doctrine said protect the bombers at all costs. The German fighters simply turned inside him. Santos called out that he was hit. Then his radio went silent. Nobody saw a parachute. Second Lieutenant James Kirkwood died on November 2nd. Kirkwood was from Nebraska. Quiet kid, 20 years old, had been in theater for 6 weeks, got separated from his flight during a bomber escort mission, and encountered 3 FW-190s alone. Tried to run, could not build enough speed. The German pilots took turns shooting at him. Kirkwood's fighter came apart in the air. Witnesses saw pieces of the aircraft falling from 9,000 feet. Second Lieutenant Paul Henderson died on November 4th. Henderson was from Georgia, had a thick accent that everyone teased him about. He could imitate every officer in the squadron perfectly, and did comedy routines at the officers' club. Henderson got into a turning fight with a single Bf-109 over the Ruhr Valley. Should have been able to escape. The German pilot was good, stayed with him through 4 complete turns. Henderson's Thunderbolt was hit in the engine and caught fire. Henderson bailed out, but his parachute did not deploy correctly. Witnesses said it looked tangled. Flight Officer Robert Chen died on November 6th. Chen was from Sacramento, same hometown as Johnson's mother. They had talked about California, about what they would do after the war. Chen wanted to open a restaurant. He got hit by anti-aircraft fire during a ground attack mission. Tried to make it back to base. Did not make it. Crashed 20 miles inside Allied lines. Recovery crews found his body in the wreckage 3 days later. Second Lieutenant William Rodriguez died on November 7th. Rodriguez was from San Antonio. He and Johnson had gone through flight training together, had shipped overseas on the same transport. Rodriguez was Johnson's closest friend in the squadron. They flew together whenever possible, covered each other. On November 7th, Rodriguez's flight encountered 6 FW-190s at 6,000 feet. Rodriguez called out that he had one on his tail. Johnson was 4 miles away, could not help, could only listen. Rodriguez tried everything, turned hard, tried to dive. The German stayed with him. Rodriguez's last transmission was, "He's still there, I can't shake him." Then, silence. Johnson searched for a parachute. Never saw one. Captain David McKenna died on November 9th. Johnson attended the memorial service. The chaplain said McKenna had died serving his country, said he was a hero, said his sacrifice would not be forgotten. Johnson stood in the back and felt rage building inside him. McKenna had not sacrificed himself. McKenna had followed the manual, had done exactly what doctrine required, and it had gotten him killed, just like Brennan, just like Santos, just like Kirkwood and Henderson and Chen and Rodriguez. The doctrine was killing pilots. The manual was wrong. But nobody in command was changing the tactics. The orders remained the same. Stay fast, stay high. Never turn with German fighters. If they get on your tail, dive away. Except diving away was not working anymore. The German pilots had adapted. They anticipated the dive. They shot American pilots during the 3 seconds of vulnerable acceleration before the Thunderbolt could build enough speed to escape. Johnson requested permission to review gun camera footage from all 19 losses in October. His squadron commander approved the request. Johnson spent 4 days in the intelligence tent watching every second of film available, studied each engagement, took notes, looked for patterns. He found one. In every single case where an American pilot died, the German pilot had gotten inside the American's turn radius and stayed there. Once a German fighter was inside your turn, you could not shake him. You could turn harder, but that bled speed and made you more vulnerable. You could try to reverse, but the German would simply reverse with you. You could try to dive, but you were already slow from turning, and the German could follow you down and shoot you during the acceleration phase. There was no escape once a German fighter got inside your turning circle. The manual said this situation should never occur. American fighters should never be in sustained turns with German fighters. But it was occurring daily, and pilots were dying daily. Johnson kept watching the films, kept taking notes. Then he noticed something else, something subtle. In the films where American pilots survived, there was often a moment where the German pilot hesitated or broke off unexpectedly. Johnson watched those sequences repeatedly, tried to figure out what caused the German pilots to disengage. In 3 separate cases, the American pilot had done something unusual just before the German broke off, something that was not in the manual, something that made no tactical sense. They had rolled inverted while in the turn. Not a full barrel roll, just a quick inverted roll, then immediately back upright while maintaining the turn. It looked chaotic, looked desperate. The American pilots probably were desperate. They were about to die. They tried something, anything, to survive. But in all 3 cases, the German pilot broke off immediately after the American rolled inverted, did not pursue, did not finish the kill, just disengaged and looked for easier targets. Johnson watched those sequences 20 times each, tried to understand what he was seeing. Then he understood. The German pilots did not expect it, did not know how to respond to it. An inverted roll in the middle of a turning engagement was so far outside normal fighter tactics that it surprised them, disrupted their aim, broke their concentration, made them uncertain about what the American pilot would do next. And in air combat, uncertainty was death. If you hesitated for even 2 seconds, you lost the advantage. The German pilots were not willing to risk pursuing an American pilot who was doing something completely unpredictable. Johnson sat alone in the intelligence tent after everyone else had left. It was after 2,200 hours, cold November night. He could hear rain on the tent roof, could hear distant artillery from the front lines 50 miles east. He thought about McKenna, about Rodriguez, about all of them. And he thought about the barrel roll that everyone said was impossible. Johnson could not sleep that night. He lay in his bunk in the officers' quarters and stared at the ceiling and thought about physics. A barrel roll was a simple maneuver in theory. You rolled the aircraft 360 degrees around its longitudinal axis while simultaneously pulling back on the stick to maintain altitude. If done correctly, you traced a corkscrew path through the air and ended up exactly where you started. Same altitude, same heading, same speed. Except you never ended up with the same speed. The maneuver cost energy, cost momentum. During the roll, your lift vector was not pointing straight up. Part of it was pointing sideways. That meant you lost altitude unless you pulled harder, which created more drag, which bled more speed. By the time you completed the roll, you were slower than when you started. And in a turning engagement where an enemy fighter was already inside your turn radius, being slower meant being dead. The enemy could turn even tighter, could get an even better firing position, could kill you more easily. That was why the manual forbade barrel rolls in combat. That was why instructors called it suicide. The physics were irrefutable. You could not afford to lose speed when someone was trying to kill you. But Johnson kept thinking about those 3 gun camera films. The American pilots who rolled inverted and survived. They had lost speed. They should have died, but they did not die. The German pilots broke off. Why? Johnson got out of his bunk, put on his flight jacket, walked outside into the cold rain, walked across the muddy airfield to where the Thunderbolts were parked in their revetments, found his aircraft, P-47D with the tail number 423681, climbed up on the wing, opened the canopy, sat in the cockpit. The cockpit was dark, smelled like oil and metal and the rubber of the oxygen mask. Johnson sat there in the darkness and put his hands on the controls. Stick in his right hand, throttle in his left. He closed his eyes and visualized a turning engagement. German fighter on his tail, inside his turn radius, closing for the kill. Johnson pulls harder on the stick, turns tighter, loses more speed. The German stays with him. Johnson is going to die in the next 5 seconds unless he does something. Johnson visualized rolling inverted, pushing the stick hard to the right. Aircraft snaps into a roll. World spins. Inverted. Sky below, ground above. G-forces pushing him into his seat. Then immediately reversing. Stick hard left. Rolling back upright. Completing a full barrel roll while maintaining the turn. He opened his eyes. He saw it now. The barrel roll did not help you escape. The barrel roll was not an evasion maneuver. You could not outturn a BF-109 or FW-190. You could not outclimb them. You could not outroll them. Well, actually, maybe you could outroll them. The Thunderbolt had incredibly effective ailerons, could snap roll faster than almost any aircraft in the sky. That was it. The barrel roll was not about escaping. It was about disruption, about breaking the enemy pilot's tracking solution, about forcing him to make a decision in the half-second when you were inverted and he could not predict which direction you would exit the roll. A German pilot tracking an American fighter in a turn had a simple geometry problem to solve. He knew where you were. He knew your speed. He knew your turn radius. He knew where you would be in 2 seconds. He aimed at that future position and fired. But if you suddenly rolled inverted in the middle of that turn, you broke all his calculations. He did not know if you would complete the roll in the same direction or reverse, did not know if you would pull up or push down, did not know if you would maintain the turn or change direction. For one critical second, he could not predict your future position. And in that 1 second of uncertainty, he had to make a choice. Keep firing and hope he got lucky, or break off and reposition for a more certain shot. Experienced German pilots would choose repositioning, because missing meant wasting ammunition, because an unpredictable target was not worth the risk, because there were easier targets in the sky. Johnson sat in the dark cockpit and felt his heart pounding. This could work. This could actually work. But there was a critical requirement. The barrel roll had to be violent, had to be fast, had to be completely unexpected. You could not execute a smooth, controlled barrel roll. That would give the enemy pilot time to track you through the maneuver. You had to snap into it. Full aileron deflection, maximum roll rate, snap inverted, snap back upright, all in under 2 seconds. The Thunderbolt could do it. The aircraft had powerful ailerons and could roll at 180 degrees per second at high speed. That meant a full 360-degree roll would take 2 seconds. Maybe less if you used rudder to accelerate the rotation. But here was the dangerous part, the part that made this genuinely risky. During those 2 seconds, you were not maneuvering defensively. You were not turning away from the enemy. You were essentially flying straight while rolling around your axis. If the enemy pilot did not break off, if he kept firing, he would hit you. You were betting your life that he would hesitate. Johnson climbed out of the cockpit, stood on the wing in the rain, looked at his Thunderbolt sitting there in the darkness. He would test it, first chance he got. Next time a German fighter got on his tail. Next time doctrine said he was dead. He would try the barrel roll, would see if it worked, would see if he survived. And if he survived, he would teach it to everyone. Johnson did not tell anyone about his plan, did not mention it to his flight leader, did not discuss it with other pilots. This was not the kind of idea you talked about. This was the kind of idea that got you grounded if the wrong person heard about it. The Army Air Forces had regulations about unauthorized modifications to doctrine. Technical Order 1-1-4 specified that pilots would execute combat maneuvers exactly as described in training manuals. Deviation from approved tactics was grounds for disciplinary action. Court-martial was possible for willful disregard of standing orders, especially if such disregard resulted in loss of aircraft or risk to other pilots. Johnson knew the regulations, had memorized them during training, but he also knew that Rodriguez was dead because he had followed those regulations. McKenna was dead because he had followed those regulations. 7 pilots from his squadron were dead because they had followed those regulations. So Johnson decided the regulations could go to hell. The opportunity came 5 days later, November 14th, 1944. Cold morning, overcast skies at 4,000 feet. The squadron was tasked with bomber escort deep into Germany. Target was an oil refinery near Merseburg. Heavy anti-aircraft fire expected. Luftwaffe interceptors certain. Johnson was flying in Blue Flight, Position 3. His flight leader was Captain Thomas Harrigan, an experienced pilot with 38 combat missions. Good officer, followed the manual religiously. If Harrigan knew what Johnson was planning, he would have grounded him immediately. The mission briefing was at 0530 hours. Takeoff at 0645. Climb to 23,000 feet. Rendezvous with the bomber formation at 0800 hours over Belgium. Escort them into Germany. Protect them from fighters. Bring everyone home. Standard mission. Johnson had flown variations of it 23 times. This would be number 24. The flight to the rendezvous point was uneventful. Clear skies above the clouds. Bomber formation appeared exactly on time. 36 B-17 flying fortresses in tight combat boxes. Beautiful and terrifying. Johnson had immense respect for bomber crews. Flying straight and level into flak and fighters took courage he was not sure he possessed. The formation crossed into German airspace at 0842. First anti-aircraft fire started at 0900 hours. Black puffs of smoke appearing around the bombers, shrapnel bursting in patterns. Johnson's flight stayed high and wide, watched for German fighters. The Luftwaffe would come. Always did when bombers penetrated this deep. The first enemy fighters appeared at 0917 hours. Somebody called them out on the radio. Bandits, 11 o'clock high, 6 miles. Johnson looked, saw them. Dark specks against the bright morning sky. Counted 8, maybe 10. Hard to tell at this distance. They were diving toward the bomber formation from altitude. Classic bounce. Harrigan called out, "Blue flight, climbing to intercept, follow me." Johnson pushed his throttle forward. 54 inches of manifold pressure, 2,500 RPM. The Thunderbolt accelerated smoothly. Johnson climbed after Harrigan. Blue 2 and Blue 4 stayed in formation. The geometry developed quickly. The German fighters were Focke-Wulf 190s. Johnson could see their profile now. Long noses, radial engines, excellent aircraft. Fast, maneuverable, dangerous. Harrigan positioned Blue Flight above and behind the German formation. Textbook intercept, dive down, use speed, hit them before they reached the bombers. Johnson armed his guns, 850s, 300 rounds per gun, enough for about 15 seconds of continuous fire if he held the trigger down. Nobody held the trigger down. You fired in short bursts, 1-second trigger pulls, conserved ammunition, increased accuracy. Harrigan called, "Blue Flight, attacking, take your pick." Harrigan rolled inverted and pulled into a split S, dove toward the German fighters. Blue 2 followed. Johnson selected a target. FW-190 at the rear of the German formation, rolling into his own attack dive. Blue 4 called that he was engaging a different target. Johnson dove, built speed rapidly, 400 miles per hour. 420, 440. The Thunderbolt was in its element now. Heavy aircraft falling like a freight train. The German pilot saw him coming, started to turn left. Johnson adjusted his dive, lined up his gun sight. The FW-190 was in his sights. Range was closing fast. 800 yards, 700, 600. Johnson pressed the trigger, short burst. Tracers arced out toward the target. Missed, too much lead. Johnson corrected, fired again. Better, saw strikes on the German fighter's left wing. Then the German pilot did exactly what Doctrine predicted. He reversed his turn, snap-rolled right, pulled hard, began a violent evasive turn. Johnson tried to follow, pulled back on his stick. The Thunderbolt groaned under the G-load, started to turn. But the FW-190 turned faster, much faster, inside Johnson's turn radius instantly. Johnson knew what was about to happen. He was about to become the target instead of the attacker. The German pilot would complete his turn, get behind Johnson, and shoot him down. Just like Rodriguez, just like McKenna, just like all of them. 3 seconds until the German completed his turn. Johnson did not think about it, did not hesitate, did exactly what he had visualized in his cockpit 5 nights earlier. He snap-rolled right. Full aileron deflection, full rudder. The Thunderbolt responded instantly. World spun. Sky became ground, ground became sky. Inverted. G-forces crushing him downward into his seat straps. Blood draining from his head. Vision narrowing. Half a second inverted. Then snap back. Full left aileron, full opposite rudder. Aircraft rolled upright. Completed a full barrel roll in under 2 seconds. Johnson pulled back on the stick, maintained his turn, looked for the German fighter. The FW-190 was gone. Not shot down, not destroyed, just gone. Broken off, disengaged. Johnson scanned the sky frantically. found the German fighter 3 seconds later, half a mile away, diving away toward low altitude, running. The German pilot had broken off. It worked. Johnson's heart was pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. His hands were shaking on the controls. He had just survived an engagement that should have killed him, should have ended exactly like Rodriguez's last fight. But it did not end that way. Because Johnson had done something the German pilot did not expect. He had done something that doctrine said was impossible. Blue Flight reformed after the engagement. Harrigan called for everyone to check in. All 4 aircraft accounted for. Nobody hit. The German fighters had disengaged after the initial attack, headed east. Blue Flight returned to escort position with the bombers. Harrigan never mentioned Johnson's barrel roll. Maybe he did not see it. Maybe he saw it and chose not to say anything. Johnson did not ask. But Johnson knew with absolute certainty. The maneuver worked, the doctrine was wrong, and he could teach this to every pilot in the squadron. He just had to survive long enough to prove it again. Johnson landed back at base at 1200 hours. Debriefing was immediate. Intelligence officers wanted details on every engagement. Number of enemy aircraft, types, altitudes, headings, results. Johnson reported that he had engaged 1 FW-190, had scored hits. Enemy aircraft had disengaged. No confirmed kill, no damage to his aircraft. The intelligence officer wrote it down in the log. Standard engagement. Nothing unusual. Johnson did not mention the barrel roll. Did not mention that he had violated doctrine. Did not mention that he had discovered something that could save lives. He spent the afternoon thinking about how to test it again. The first time could have been luck, could have been a nervous German pilot, could have been coincidence. Johnson needed to prove the technique worked consistently, needed to see it work multiple times, needed to understand the exact parameters. How fast did you need to be? How violent did the roll need to be? Would it work at low altitude or only at high altitude? Would it work against experienced pilots or only against novices? Johnson needed data, needed combat results, needed proof. He got his chance 3 days later. November 17, 1944. The mission was a fighter sweep over the Rhine Valley. No bombers to escort, just fighters hunting for German aircraft. Free-ranging mission, squadron strength 16 Thunderbolts. They took off at 0700 hours, climbed to 18,000 feet, headed east into Germany. Johnson was flying Blue 3 again, same position as 3 days earlier. Harrigan was leading. The weather was perfect, clear skies, unlimited visibility. Cold at altitude, minus 30 degrees Celsius. Johnson's oxygen mask frosted over from his breath. They found German fighters at 0821 hours, a formation of Bf-109s. Somebody counted 12 of them, flying in spread formation at 16,000 feet, heading west toward Allied lines. Probably a fighter sweep of their own. Harrigan called the bounce. The squadron had altitude advantage. 2,000 feet, perfect position. The Thunderbolts rolled over and dove. Johnson picked his target. Bf-109 flying left flank position, dove at him, built speed to 420 miles per hour. The Messerschmitt saw him coming, turned hard right, pulled into a steep climbing turn. Johnson followed, started turning with him. Big mistake. The Bf-109 could outturn the Thunderbolt in a climbing turn. Everyone knew that. Doctrine said never follow a Messerschmitt into a climbing turn. But Johnson was committed now, already turning, already in the engagement, pulling back on the stick, following the German fighter up and around. The Messerschmitt turned inside him, much tighter radius. The German pilot was good, experienced. He completed his turn, got behind Johnson. Johnson could not see him but knew he was there, could feel it. That terrible awareness that someone was lining up to kill you. Johnson pulled harder, turned tighter, bleeding speed rapidly. The Thunderbolt shuddered on the edge of a stall. Airspeed dropped below 200 miles per hour. Dangerous speed. Dangerous situation. The German pilot fired. Johnson heard the cannon rounds passing his aircraft, heard the distinctive thump, thump, thump of 20mm shells exploding nearby, saw tracers flashing past his canopy. Close. Very close. 2 seconds until the German adjusted his aim and hit him. Johnson snap-rolled left. Full aileron. Full rudder. Violent roll. The Thunderbolt went inverted instantly. G-forces slammed him into his straps. His vision went gray from the blood draining from his head. He held the roll for 1 full second, then snapped back. Full right aileron, full opposite rudder, rolled upright, completed the barrel roll, pulled back on the stick, maintained his turn. The Messerschmitt was gone. Johnson looked for it, found it 4 seconds later, diving away, breaking off the engagement, running. The German pilot had broken off again. It worked again. Johnson felt a rush of exhilaration. This was not luck. This was not coincidence. This was a genuine tactical technique. Something repeatable. Something that worked. But Johnson did not have time to celebrate. The sky was full of aircraft. Friendlies and enemies mixed together in a chaotic furball. Radio channels were jammed with calls. "Break right! I'm hit! Where's my wingman? 3 Messerschmitts at 4 o'clock!" Johnson climbed back to altitude, looked for his flight. Could not find Harrigan. Could not find Blue 2 or Blue 4. Everyone was scattered. Johnson saw another Thunderbolt below him, being chased by a Bf-109. The German was firing, hitting the Thunderbolt. Smoke was trailing from the American fighter's engine. Johnson dove to help, came in behind the Messerschmitt, lined up his guns, fired a long burst. 3 seconds of continuous fire saw strikes all over the German fighter. Pieces flew off. The Messerschmitt rolled over and went down, trailing fire. Johnson followed the damaged Thunderbolt, formed up on his wing. It was Blue 4, Lieutenant Donald Patterson. Patterson's engine was shot up but still running. He gave Johnson a thumbs up. They climbed together, got out of the fight, headed west toward Allied lines. The squadron regrouped over Belgium 20 minutes later. Harrigan called for everyone to check in. 14 aircraft checked in. 2 missing. Johnson felt his stomach drop. 2 pilots were not coming home. They landed at 1300 hours. Johnson climbed out of his cockpit. His crew chief was waiting. Asked if the aircraft was okay. Johnson said it was fine, no damage. The crew chief looked relieved. Johnson walked to the debriefing. The intelligence officer went through each pilot's report. Harrigan had damaged 1 Messerschmitt. Blue 2 had shot down a Bf-109, confirmed. Patterson had been hit but survived. Johnson had saved Patterson's life by shooting down his attacker. Then they went through the losses. Lieutenant William Morrison, Lieutenant Frank Delgado. Both had been shot down. Nobody saw parachutes. Both were presumed dead. Johnson sat in the debriefing room and felt the weight of it. 2 more names to add to the list. 2 more pilots who had followed doctrine. 2 more pilots who could not outturn German fighters. After the debriefing, Johnson found Patterson, asked him what had happened. Patterson said he got into a turning engagement with 2 Messerschmitts, tried to dive away. One of them predicted it and shot him during the dive, just like the gun camera films Johnson had studied. Johnson asked Patterson if he had tried anything unusual, any unorthodox maneuvers. Patterson looked confused, said no, had followed doctrine, had done what he was trained to do. Johnson made a decision right there. He was going to teach this technique to everyone, was going to demonstrate it, was going to prove it worked, and he did not care if it got him court-martialed. Morrison and Delgado were dead. Rodriguez was dead. McKenna was dead. 7 others were dead. Doctrine was killing pilots. Johnson had found something that worked, and he was going to share it even if it meant facing disciplinary action. That evening, Johnson approached Harrigan, asked if he could speak privately. Harrigan agreed. They walked away from the other pilots. Johnson told him everything, Told him about studying the gun camera films, about noticing the inverted rolls, about his theory, about testing it twice successfully, about wanting to teach it to the squadron. Harrigan listened without interrupting. When Johnson finished, Harrigan was quiet for a long time. Then he said something Johnson did not expect. "I saw you do it, both times. I thought you were dead both times. Then you came out of it alive. I don't know how it works, but I saw it work." Johnson waited. Harrigan continued. "I can't officially approve this. It's not in the manual. Group would crucify me if they found out I was teaching unauthorized tactics. But I'm also tired of writing letters to families. So here's what we're going to do. Tomorrow morning, you're going to demonstrate this maneuver to the entire squadron. I'm going to tell everyone it's an experimental tactic that you developed. I'm going to tell them it's not officially approved. I'm going to tell them they can try it if they want, but they're taking personal risk. And then I'm going to turn around and pretend I never heard any of this conversation. Understood?" Johnson understood. The next morning at 0600 hours, every pilot in the 487th Fighter Squadron assembled in the briefing room. 21 pilots. Harrigan called Johnson to the front. Said Johnson had something to show them. Johnson stood in front of his squadron, looked at faces he knew. Friends, wingmen, good pilots. Some of them would be dead in the next month if they kept following doctrine. He told them about the barrel roll. Johnson taught them everything, explained the theory, explained why German pilots broke off when American pilots did something unpredictable, explained the physics of the maneuver, explained the risks, explained that it only worked if you executed it violently and unexpectedly, explained that it was not an evasion technique, explained that it was a disruption technique, explained that it bought you 3 seconds to escape or reposition, explained that those 3 seconds were the difference between living and dying. Then he demonstrated it. Johnson took his Thunderbolt up to 8,000 feet with the entire squadron watching from the ground. Harrigan flew chase in a second Thunderbolt, acted as the attacking German fighter. Harrigan got on Johnson's tail, called it out over the radio so everyone could hear. Johnson was in a hard turn. Harrigan was inside his turn. Harrigan announced he was firing, simulated firing. Johnson snap-rolled, full barrel roll in under 2 seconds, came out of it in a different heading. Harrigan called out that he had lost his tracking solution, had to reposition. Johnson had escaped. They did it 3 more times. 3 different scenarios, 3 different altitudes. Same result every time. The barrel roll broke the attacker's aim point, forced repositioning, bought time. Johnson landed. The squadron gathered around him. Pilots asked questions. How much speed did you lose? How violent does it have to be? Can you do it at low altitude? Can you do it when you're already near stall speed? Will it work against multiple attackers? Johnson answered every question, admitted what he did not know, explained what he had learned from combat. Some pilots were skeptical, some were interested, some wanted to try it immediately. Harrigan told everyone they could practice it if they wanted, but it was not officially sanctioned. They were on their own if something went wrong. If they crashed practicing an unauthorized maneuver, group would not be sympathetic. Over the next 2 weeks, 16 pilots practiced the barrel roll, practiced it at different altitudes, different speeds, different scenarios. They worked in pairs. One pilot acted as the attacker. One pilot practiced the defensive role. They refined the technique, figured out the minimum speed where it still worked, figured out the maximum G-load the aircraft could handle during the snap roll, figured out how to use rudder to accelerate the roll rate. 3 pilots decided not to learn it, said it was too risky, said they would stick with doctrine. Johnson did not argue with them, told them he understood, told them it was their choice. The squadron flew 6 more missions in late November. On 4 of those missions, pilots used the barrel roll defensively. In every case, the German fighter broke off. In every case, the American pilot survived an engagement that should have killed him. Word spread to other squadrons in the group. Pilots talked at the officers' club, described the maneuver. Other squadrons started practicing it. Within 3 weeks, most of the 352nd Fighter Group knew about Johnson's barrel roll. Nobody called it that officially. Nobody put it in writing, but pilots knew, and pilots who wanted to survive learned it. Group Command never officially acknowledged it, never approved it, never prohibited it. Senior officers had to have heard about it, but nobody said anything. The losses had dropped. November had been a terrible month. December was better. Pilots were surviving engagements that would have killed them in October. The official explanation was that American pilots were gaining experience, were learning to fight better, were getting smarter about tactics. The unofficial explanation was that Johnson had figured out something that doctrine missed, and pilots who wanted to live were using it. Then came December 7th, 1944. The mission briefing was at 0500 hours. The target was a German armor concentration near the Rhine River. Reports said 2 panzer divisions were assembling for a counterattack. Allied ground forces wanted air support, wanted the fighter bombers to hit the tank columns before they could move. The 352nd Fighter Group was assigned to provide fighter escort for the attack. The full squadron was launching. 23 Thunderbolts. Johnson had never seen the entire squadron launch together. This was going to be a major operation. Harrigan briefed the mission, said intelligence reported heavy Luftwaffe presence in the area, said to expect significant enemy fighter opposition, said the Germans were desperate, said they would throw everything they had at the American formation. Johnson felt nervous. This was going to be a big fight, the biggest he had been in. 23 American fighters sounded like a lot, but if the Germans had 50 or 60 fighters, the Americans would be outnumbered more than 2 to 1. Takeoff was at 0600 hours. The entire squadron climbed together. Formed up in flights of 4, Harrigan led. Johnson was flying Blue 3. Same position he had flown all month. The weather was cold, clear. Visibility was unlimited. They could see for 50 miles. They reached the target area at 0741 hours. Johnson saw the tank columns below. Long lines of vehicles moving along roads. Dozens of tanks, maybe hundreds. The fighter bombers were already attacking, diving down, dropping bombs. Johnson could see explosions, could see smoke rising from destroyed vehicles. Then somebody called out, "Enemy fighters." Johnson looked up, saw them. A massive formation of German fighters high and to the east. Johnson counted, stopped counting at 30. There were more than 50, maybe 60. Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s, mixed formation, all diving toward the American fighter bombers. Harrigan called it out. "All flights climbing to intercept. Stay together. Watch your wingmen." The squadron climbed. 23 Thunderbolts against more than 50 German fighters. Terrible odds. Johnson's mouth was dry. His heart was pounding. This was bad. This was the kind of fight where half the American pilots did not come home. The Germans dove through the American formation, scattered them. Chaos immediately. Aircraft everywhere, turning, diving, firing. Johnson lost sight of his flight leader, lost sight of everyone, found himself alone with 2 Bf-109s on his tail. They were firing, cannon rounds passing close. Johnson turned hard left, pulled maximum G. The Thunderbolt groaned. Johnson's vision narrowed. The Messerschmitts turned inside him, got closer, lined up for the kill. Johnson snap-rolled, barrel roll, violent and fast. Came out of it in a different heading, looked for the Messerschmitts. They had broken off, both of them, disengaged immediately, just like Johnson knew they would. Johnson climbed, found another Thunderbolt, formed up on his wing. It was Lieutenant Patterson. They stayed together, watched each other's backs. Johnson saw another Thunderbolt being chased by AFW-190, dove to help, got behind the German fighter, fired, missed. The FW-190 saw him, reversed, came at Johnson head-on. Both aircraft fired. Tracers filled the space between them. Johnson snap-rolled at the last second, avoided collision. The FW-190 flashed past him. Johnson rolled upright. The German was gone, had disengaged. The battle lasted 14 minutes. Felt like hours. Johnson used the barrel roll 4 times. Every time the German pilot broke off. Every time, Johnson survived. Finally, the German fighters disengaged, headed east, out of ammunition or low on fuel. The American fighters regrouped, climbed to altitude. Harrigan called for everyone to check in. 23 aircraft checked in. 23. Every single pilot was alive. Not everyone was undamaged. 6 aircraft had battle damage, bullet holes, cannon strikes. But every pilot was alive. Every aircraft was flying. Everyone was coming home. Johnson could not believe it. The squadron had been outnumbered more than 2 to 1, had been scattered, had been fighting for their lives, and everyone survived. Harrigan called out confirmed kills over the radio. The squadron had shot down 14 German fighters. Confirmed. Gun camera footage would verify it later. 14 German aircraft destroyed. 0 American losses. They landed at 0900 hours. Johnson climbed out of his cockpit. His hands were still shaking. His crew chief asked if he was okay. Johnson said yes, said he was fine. But he was not fine. He was overwhelmed. 23 pilots had gone out. 23 pilots had come back. That never happened. That was impossible, but it happened. Harrigan gathered the squadron after debriefing, stood in front of all of them, was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I've been flying combat missions for 11 months. This is the first time my entire squadron came home from a major engagement. Every single one of you. I don't care what group command says. I don't care what the manual says. Whatever you're doing, keep doing it." Everyone knew what he meant. Everyone knew what had saved them. The barrel roll, Johnson's technique, the unauthorized maneuver that doctrine said was impossible. Pilots came up to Johnson afterward, shook his hand, said thank you, said the maneuver had saved their lives, said they had used it, said it worked exactly like Johnson said it would. Patterson told Johnson he had used it twice, had survived both times, said he would have died without it. 3 days later, Johnson was called to group headquarters. He thought he was going to be court-martialed, thought someone had finally reported the unauthorized tactics, thought his flying career was over. Instead, he walked into the group commander's office and found Colonel James Stewart waiting. Stewart was a West Point graduate, career officer, not the kind of man who tolerated violations of doctrine. Johnson stood at attention, waited for the hammer to fall. Stewart looked at him for a long moment, then said, "I've been reviewing the after-action reports from December 7th. Your squadron faced more than 50 enemy fighters. Every pilot returned. 14 confirmed kills. 0 losses. That's the best combat ratio I've seen in 6 months. I want to know how you did it." Johnson told him everything. The gun camera footage, the theory, the barrel roll, the testing, the training, the combat results. He expected Stewart to get angry, expected to be grounded. Stewart listened to everything. Then he said, "This maneuver is not in the manual. It violates established doctrine. I should probably court-martial everyone involved." Johnson said nothing, waited. Stewart continued, "But I've lost 63 pilots in the last 4 months. 63. I've written 63 letters to families. I'm tired of writing letters. If you've found something that keeps pilots alive, I don't care if it's in the manual or not. As of today, your technique is approved for use by all squadrons in this group. I want you to train every pilot. I want gun camera footage showing it works. I want documentation, and I want it done quietly. This does not go up the chain to Wing or to 8th Air Force. We keep this internal. Understood?" Johnson understood. Stewart dismissed him. As Johnson was leaving, Stewart said one more thing. "Lieutenant Johnson, you saved 23 lives on December 7th. Probably more than that if we count all the pilots who have used this technique. The Army does not give medals for unauthorized tactics, but I want you to know that what you did matters. You found a way to keep pilots alive. That's worth more than any medal. Johnson walked out of group headquarters, stood in the cold December air, felt the weight of it. 23 pilots, all alive, all home. Because he had studied gun camera footage, because he had thought about physics, because he had been willing to break the rules when the rules were getting people killed. He thought about McKenna, about Rodriguez, about all of them. Wished they had known about the barrel roll. Wished they had survived. But they had not survived. They had followed doctrine. They had done everything right. And they had died. Johnson would not let anyone else die the same way. He would train every pilot in the group, would make sure everyone knew the technique, would make sure everyone had the same chance to survive that he had. And he would keep flying, keep fighting, keep using the maneuver that everyone said was impossible, because it was not impossible, it was real, it worked, and it saved lives. Johnson flew 68 more combat missions between December 1944 and May 1945. Used the barrel roll 17 more times, survived every engagement, shot down 6 German aircraft confirmed, damaged 8 others, returned home to Texas in July 1945 with the Distinguished Flying Cross and 3 air medals. He never spoke publicly about the barrel roll, never wrote about it, never claimed credit for it. The technique spread throughout the 8th Air Force by word of mouth. Pilots taught it to other pilots. Squadrons adopted it unofficially. By March 1945, most American fighter pilots in Europe knew about the defensive barrel roll. They did not know who had invented it, did not know where it came from, just knew it worked. The official statistics tell part of the story. Between December 1944 and May 1945, American fighter pilot casualties in the European theater dropped by 31% compared to the previous 6 months. The Army Air Forces attributed this to improved training, better tactics, and declining Luftwaffe quality as experienced German pilots were killed or captured. All of that was true, but it was not the complete explanation. Pilots survived because they had learned something that was not in the manual, had learned something that doctrine said was impossible, had learned something from a 22-year-old lieutenant from Amarillo, Texas, who studied gun camera footage and thought about physics, and was willing to break the rules when the rules were killing people. After the war, Johnson returned to civilian life, worked as a crop duster, then as a flight instructor, then as a commercial pilot for Trans World Airlines. Retired in 1979. Never gave interviews about his military service. Never attended reunions. Never sought recognition. Died in 1994 at the age of 72. His obituary in the Amarillo newspaper mentioned that he had served in World War II as a fighter pilot. Did not mention the Distinguished Flying Cross. Did not mention the barrel roll. Did not mention that his innovation had saved hundreds of lives. The technique itself was eventually incorporated into official Air Force fighter tactics in the 1950s. By then, it was called the defensive barrel roll, or sometimes the last-ditch maneuver. Training manuals described it as a desperation technique to be used when conventional evasion tactics had failed. The manuals did not mention Robert Johnson, did not mention the 352nd Fighter Group, did not mention December 7, 1944, when 23 pilots came home alive because one of them had figured out how to survive. At the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio, a restored P-47 Thunderbolt sits on display in the World War II gallery. The placard describes the Thunderbolt's specifications: 7-ton weight, 8 50 caliber machine guns, 2,000 horsepower engine, maximum speed of 427 miles per hour, combat radius of 475 miles. The placard mentions that more than 15,000 Thunderbolts were built during the war, mentions that the aircraft served in every theater, mentions that it had an excellent combat record. The placard does not mention Robert Johnson, does not mention the barrel roll, does not mention that sometimes the most important innovations in warfare come not from engineers or generals or doctrine writers, but from young pilots who are scared and desperate and willing to try something that everyone says cannot work. That is how wars are won, not by following the manual, not by doing what you are told, but by thinking, by observing, by recognizing when doctrine is wrong, by having the courage to break the rules when the rules are killing people. Johnson understood that. Understood it in November 1944 when he watched his friends die because they followed doctrine. Understood it when he studied gun camera footage and saw patterns that nobody else saw. Understood it when he sat alone in his cockpit at night and visualized a maneuver that everyone said was suicide. Understood it when he tested it in combat and proved it worked. Understood it when he taught it to his squadron and saved 23 lives in a single battle. He understood that the difference between living and dying is often one person willing to think differently, one person willing to question authority, one person willing to say that the experts are wrong and then prove it in combat. The 352nd Fighter Group lost 36 pilots between September and November 1944. Lost 8 pilots in December after Johnson introduced his technique. Lost 6 pilots between January and May 1945 as more pilots adopted it. The numbers are stark. Before the barrel roll, the squadron lost an average of 12 pilots per month. After the barrel roll, they lost an average of 2 pilots per month. Those are not just statistics. Those are lives, names, faces. Men who went home to families, men who had children, men who lived full lives because a 22-year-old lieutenant from Texas refused to accept that doctrine was absolute. Johnson never talked about it, never claimed he had saved anyone. When other pilots thanked him, he deflected, said he just got lucky, said anyone would have figured it out eventually, said he was not special. But Johnson was wrong about that. He was special. Not because he was a better pilot than anyone else, not because he was braver or smarter or more skilled, but because he paid attention, because he thought critically, because he was willing to test an idea that everyone said was impossible. And because of that, 23 pilots came home on December 7, 1944, came home to bases in Belgium and France, came home to write letters to families, came home to fly again the next day, came home to survive the war, came home to have lives and families and futures. All because one pilot discovered that the impossible was actually possible if you were willing to try. That is Robert Johnson's legacy. Not a medal, not official recognition, not a mention in the history books, but hundreds of pilots who lived because he figured out how to survive. Hundreds of families who were not torn apart by loss. Hundreds of lives that continued because one man refused to accept that there was no solution to the problem that was killing his friends. The barrel roll is still taught today. Modern fighter pilots learn it in advanced tactical training. They call it a last resort defensive maneuver. They practice it at high altitude with strict safety protocols. They learn that it only works under specific conditions. They learn that it is risky. They learn that it should only be used when all other options have failed. But they do not learn where it came from. Do not learn about Robert Johnson. Do not learn about November 1944. Do not learn about 23 pilots coming home alive against impossible odds. They should learn those things, because the lesson is not just about the barrel roll. The lesson is about courage, about thinking critically, about questioning authority when authority is wrong, about ordinary people changing the course of history by refusing to accept that the way things are is the way things must be. That is what Robert Johnson did. That is what makes his story important. Not the tactical innovation itself, but what the innovation represents. One person, scared and grieving and desperate, who decided that the rules were wrong, who decided to test a new idea, who decided to share that idea with others, who decided that saving lives was more important than following regulations. Wars are not won by the people who follow orders blindly. Wars are won by the people who think, who observe, who question, who innovate, who take risks, who care more about results than about regulations, who understand that doctrine is a starting point, not a destination, who recognize that the best solution is not always in the manual. Robert Johnson understood all of that, and because he did, he changed how fighter pilots fought, changed how they survived, changed the outcome of battles, changed lives. Did all of it without recognition, without awards, without anyone outside his small circle even knowing his name. That is the real story. Not that a barrel roll saved 23 pilots, but that one ordinary person had the courage to think differently, and that courage rippled outward, saved lives, changed tactics, made history, all while remaining completely invisible to the historians who would write the official accounts. Somewhere in a storage facility, the gun camera footage from Johnson's Thunderbolt still exists. Hundreds of hours of film showing missions over Germany, showing engagements with enemy fighters, showing the moment when Johnson snap-rolled and survived encounters that should have killed him. Nobody watches that footage now. Nobody studies it. Nobody knows it contains the evidence of one of the most important tactical innovations of the air war in Europe. But it is there, waiting. A record of what happened when one pilot decided that impossible was just a word, that survival was possible, that the rules could be broken if breaking them meant coming home alive. Robert Johnson broke those rules, and 23 pilots came home on December 7, 1944. Every single one.